The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical prayer, same as they did at 0600 every morning, same as they would at midnight when the night shift collapsed into their chairs. Seattle General's ICU in Savannah smelled like antiseptic and something underneath it, the copper tang of old blood, no matter how many times housekeeping wiped the floors with bleach solution. Ashley Cooper moved through that smell like it was weather she'd already survived. Her scrubs were navy blue, identical to everyone else's, but they hung on her frame with a precision that wasn't taught in nursing school. The creases were sharp enough to cut glass. Her movements had the terrifying fluid grace of someone who'd already calculated 17 exit routes before entering a room. When she walked, there was the faintest hitch in her left leg, so subtle most people didn't register it, the kind of compensation that came from a wound that had healed wrong or healed fast, depending on the story you believed. The scar tissue on her forearms formed patterns only another soldier would recognize. Parallel lines. Deliberate. Strategic. Those scars had names. In her locker, underneath her civilian clothes folded with military precision, hung a worn jacket. The lining was the color of sand that had seen too much sun. Sewn into that lining, invisible unless you opened it, was a patch. Faded Special Forces emblem. Gold and black, worn soft as cloth that had been held too many times by hands that were trying to remember what normal felt like. It was 08 for 7 on a Tuesday when room 347's new patient arrived. Master Sergeant Vincent Torres came up from surgery on a gurney, his posture already teaching everyone in the hallway about pain management through conscious refinement. No monitors broadcasting his distress. No groans. He was the kind of patient who made other patients look like they were overacting. His chart said post-op abdominal reconstruction, status stable, no visitors listed. His chart also said deaf, which meant everything that happened next would depend on whether anyone in this hospital remembered that communication was the first vital sign. Ashley was in room 345, checking the 4 line on a post-cardiac patient who wouldn't look at her, when she heard Dr. Pierce's voice in the hallway. Pierce had the kind of voice that made air pressure change, not loud, just dense, the way a storm front moves in without asking permission. He was doing rounds with his standard entourage, residents trailing like pilot fish behind a shark, their eyes already locked on whatever the boss's expression might reveal about whether they were smart enough for the next level. Room 347 is our transfer from recovery, Pierce said, his shoes clicking against the tile with the rhythm of someone who'd never once worried about waking a patient. Surgical reconstruction. Keep the chart clean, keep the vital signs documented, keep him comfortable. Standard post-op protocol. No exceptions. Ashley finished adjusting before drip. The patient still wouldn't look at her. She'd learned that some people's shame was too heavy to share space with witnesses. She'd learned to give them that privacy anyway. She was in the break room at 12:15, eating a sandwich she'd brought from home because the hospital cafeteria added corn syrup to everything, when she saw the assignment board updated. Torres was now in her section. 3 other patients, 1 recovery case, and a deaf man nobody had thought to ask how he preferred to communicate. Most hospitals had interpreters. Most hospitals had policies about accessibility. Ashley had learned a long time ago that most hospitals were not actually most hospitals, they were just most hospitals doing the minimum and calling it compassion. That afternoon, she volunteered for Torres's care rotation. Pierce was standing near the medication cart when she made the request. His eyes flickered across her face, a calculation, not a recognition. She was a competent nurse. She was deferential. She took the difficult cases without complaint. In his assessment, she was unremarkable. In his calculus, she was low risk and useful. He nodded and moved on to berate a resident about a sodium level that was off by 2 points. The hitch in Ashley's left leg became slightly more pronounced as she walked into room 347. Torres was awake, staring at the ceiling with the kind of focus that suggested he was mentally reviewing every decision that had led him to this particular hospital bed in this particular city. His left arm was supported by a foam wedge to prevent strain on the surgical site. An epidural catheter ran into his spine. The monitor beside his bed was a gentle conversation of beeps and numbers: heart rate 72, oxygen saturation 97, blood pressure 118/71, all the mathematics of survival reduced to readouts a machine could understand. Ashley set down her tablet and met his eyes. Then she opened her hands, palms outward, and signed welcome. Torres's eyes widened. Not the polite surprise of someone seeing something unexpected. The recognition of someone who'd just realized the room had changed. The silence shifted. She signed her name. She signed what she was here to do. She signed that pain was information, and she wanted to know what information his body was giving. She signed slowly, clearly, with a deliberate precision of someone who'd studied this language in her own time, learning it from instructional videos at 2,200 hours when the apartment was quiet and the weight of hidden things felt lighter if you were actively becoming something else. Torres signed back. Carefully. Testing. His hands moved with the muscle memory of someone who'd been communicating this way since long before his ears stopped working. His left hand was weak from the surgery, but his right was steady. Strong. He signed a question: where did she learn? Ashley didn't answer directly. Instead, she checked his vitals. She adjusted his dressing. She verified the epidural was running at the correct rate. She did all the technical, measurable things that were her job. But her hands remained visible the entire time. Her posture remained open. Her face remained the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst thing that could happen, so nothing else actually had much power. When she hung his new bag, she signed again: "What can I do to make you more comfortable?" Torres lay there for a moment. His chest rose and fell with the measured rhythm of someone who'd learned breathing was an exercise in discipline. Then he signed: "Treat me like a person who can hear you, just not with his ears." Ashley held his gaze. In that moment, nothing was hidden. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like mechanical insects. The monitor continued its gentle electronic prayer. Outside the window, Savannah's afternoon pressed against the glass like something trying to get in or something trying to get out. The light had that quality of heat shimmer that made the world look like it was vibrating at a frequency human eyes weren't quite designed to process. She signed, "I will." That evening, after her shift ended at 1900 hours, Ashley sat in her apartment with her laptop open and her hands moving through practice drills she'd already memorized. She'd been learning sign language for 4 months, in the small hours between her shifts, because she'd learned a long time ago that the best way to become invisible is to be useful to people who didn't expect you to be useful. She'd learned that small acts of precision could change how people calculated your value. She'd learned that change came slowly, methodically, one conversation at a time. The next morning, at 06:02, she arrived at Seattle General and went directly to room 347. Torres was awake. She signed, "How was the night?" She asked about pain levels. She asked if he needed anything. She brought him water with a straw position so he could drink without moving his surgical site. She adjusted his pillows with the competence of someone who'd handled far heavier bodies in far worse conditions. By the third day of her shift rotation in his section, Torres's family had noticed. His daughter, who came during afternoon visiting hours, watched Ashley sign the discharge information slowly enough that her father could understand each instruction. The daughter's eyes got wet. She didn't cry, but her eyes got wet in the way that happens when someone does something kind without announcing that it was kind, without expecting gratitude or recognition. It was on that third day, Friday at 1015 hours during rounds, when Dr. Pierce paused outside room 347 and made an observation to his residents. "Cooper's overcommitted to the difficult cases," he said, his voice carrying that particular tone of dismissal that masquerades as concern. "It's admirable, in a way. But it can be a distraction from proper protocol. Focus breeds results. Scattered compassion just breeds liability." The residents nodded. They were learning how to think. They were learning how to manage up. They were learning that mercy was something to be careful about, controlled, rationed, measured. Ashley, standing 3 rooms down with her hands deep in a medication preparation, didn't look up. Her jaw tightened by approximately 2 millimeters, the kind of physical response that would have been invisible on any video footage. Her hands remained steady. The hitch in her left leg, when she finally moved, was no more pronounced than it had been any other day. But something had shifted. Something had been named, acknowledged, registered as a problem to be solved. She had no idea what was about to come. Not yet. None of them did. Thursday morning at Seattle General, Dr. Pierce entered the conference room like a man arriving at his own coronation. 12 residents stood clustered around the grand rounds table, coffee cups steaming, tablets glowing. He held up Ashley's patient chart as if it were contaminated evidence, his fingers gripping the edges like a prosecutor presenting Exhibit A to a jury that had already convicted. This, Pierce announced, his voice carrying the theatrical precision of a conductor raising his baton, is what dangerously unorthodox documentation looks like. He paused, letting the words settle. The residents leaned in. Nurse Cooper has decided that hospital protocol doesn't apply to her. Notice the excessive narrative detail here. Notice the, another calculated pause, emotional language about patient comfort. Patient comfort. He said it like the words tasted wrong in his mouth. 2 residents snickered. The sound traveled across the tile floor and bounced off the antiseptic scrubbed walls. Ashley stood against the far wall, spine straight as a loaded rifle, hands clasped at her waist. Her scrubs were pristine. Her badge, clipped at a perfect angle, caught the fluorescent light. But her eyes were tracking Pierce with the kind of attention a thermal scope gives to heat signatures. Not emotional. Analytical. Measuring. She took one measured breath through her nose, the kind of breathing that came from a decade of keeping her body chemistry calm when her mind wanted to move. Pierce made direct eye contact with her across the room, his gaze a surgical instrument designed to wound. Perhaps military-style note-taking works differently in field hospitals, he continued, his smile widening, but here we follow standards. The laughter rippled again. Louder this time. Someone dropped their pen, it clattered against the tile in the brief silence before the next wave of amusement. Ashley's jaw tightened, just barely, a microscopic hardening of the muscle, but she held Pierce's stare. Her left eye delivered a single tear, absolutely silent in its descent. She didn't blink. Didn't look away. Reached up and wiped it from her cheek with the same precision she'd used to check a sterile field. When her hand dropped back to her side, her expression hadn't shifted an inch. "Sir," she said, her voice dropping into registers that hadn't been there a moment before, "thoroughness isn't a liability. It's accountability. For words. For words that carried the weight of someone who had written down vitals over bodies that stopped breathing anyway, who had documented fluid intake and output for soldiers who didn't have veins anymore, who understood that a chart was sometimes the only witness left standing." Pierce's smile froze. He closed Ashley's chart with a soft thud and turned back to the residents, launching into a lecture on regulatory compliance. But his jaw was clenched in a way that suggested he'd bitten down on something bitter. Tuesday afternoon, the vending machine hummed its mechanical rhythm in the corner of the break room, a sound like a small engine perpetually angry. Ashley needed coffee. Actual coffee, not the institutional sludge from the nursing station pot. She'd been awake for 32 hours. The kind of awake where your bones feel like they're made of static electricity and your hands operate on pure muscle memory. Pierce positioned himself between her and the exit with the kind of casual precision that suggested he'd been waiting. His tie was silk. His shoes were Italian leather. His cologne smelled like money and the particular arrogance that comes from never being told no by anyone who mattered. "You know, Ashley, can I call you Ashley?" he began, leaning against the vending machine in a posture designed to seem relaxed while simultaneously blocking her path. "I've been thinking about your future here at Seattle General." He tilted his head slightly. "You'd probably be more comfortable at a community clinic. Somewhere your unique background would be appreciated. Somewhere standards are lower, and someone like you could really, flourish." 10 feet away, 2 orderlies suddenly became fascinated by their phones with the intensity of archaeologists studying ancient texts. Their ears, however, remained at full volume. Ashley's jaw tightened again. She took one measured breath. Her eyes, which had been soft during patient rounds, shifted into focus like a camera lens finding its target. When she spoke, her voice had dropped half an octave. "I'm comfortable taking care of people who deserve excellence, sir. All of them." She didn't wait for his response. She reached past him to the vending machine, inserted $2 with a kind of precision that suggested she was performing a surgical procedure, selected her coffee, and walked out carrying the cup like it was the only thing that mattered. The orderlies didn't look up from their phones, but one of them exhaled very slowly. Pierce watched her go, his expression darkening like a storm front moving inland. Wednesday evening, Ashley spent her 30-minute break in room 347. Master Sergeant Torres sat propped at a 60-degree angle, his surgical wound healing along the careful line where precision and time intersect. Ashley had learned 17 new signs this week. Her hands moved through the language like someone reclaiming territory, slow, intentional, each gesture carrying the weight of actual communication instead of the performance of it. Medication schedule, she signed, her fingers painting the words in the air between them. Morning dose with food. Evening dose without food. 3 days, then Dr. Pierce reviews. She paused, her hand settling. You need to rest. Healing needs silence. Torres understood before she even finished. His eyes, the eyes of someone who'd survived 7 deployments and watched people he loved get loaded onto helicopters in body bags, crinkled at the corners. He signed back something that translated roughly to "Thank you, nurse." That's when Pierce appeared in the doorway like something that had crawled out of the hospital's ventilation system. With him stood a security guard, young, uncomfortable, clearly understanding that he was being asked to perform a role he didn't want to play. "Nurse Cooper," Pierce announced, his voice carrying the weight of official procedure, "this is an authorized patient contact outside your assigned duties." He stepped into the room, his presence making the air pressure change. "Continue this behavior and I'll have you escorted from the building. Consider this your final warning." Torres watched the body language, reading the threat in Pierce's posture the way a man reads a weapon. Ashley turned to Torres and signed, "Quick and clean, I'll be back." To Pierce, she moved with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived worse, much worse, the kind of worse that leaves permanent impressions on your organs and your sleep schedule. "Threatening me doesn't change that he needs someone who can communicate with him," she said, her voice absolutely flat, absolutely sure. "He's deaf, Dr. Pierce. The other nurses don't speak his language." "I do." "We'll see how long that lasts," Pierce said, and turned on his heel, the security guard following like a remora fish trailing a shark. But what he didn't know, what nobody knew except Ashley, was that she'd already discovered the pattern. 3 days ago, while reviewing Torres's post-operative orders, she'd noticed the discrepancy. The surgical kit logged in the system, premium stainless steel, model designation with a price tag north of $8,000. The packaging in room 347's trash can, something older, cheaper, outdated by at least 4 model generations. She'd cross-referenced quietly. 3 other recent surgical patients. Same pattern. Equipment billed as premium, delivered as inferior. The substitutions were subtle enough that nobody caught them in the operational chaos of the hospital. Nobody except a nurse trained to notice when things didn't add up, trained by years in the field where discrepancies meant someone bled out. That evening, Pierce sat alone in his office with his door closed and his computer screen glowing. His assistant had mentioned it casually during rounds. Cooper was asking questions about the surgical kits. Asking questions. The words had landed in Pierce's chest like a bullet finding muscle. He opened his personnel file for Ashley Cooper and began typing. Methodical. Precise. 7 formal complaints constructed like load-bearing walls designed to support specific weight, dangerous documentation practices citing obscure Joint Commission Regulation 3.7.2, insubordinate communication patterns invoking Hospital Policy Handbook Section 12, unauthorized deviation from care protocols referencing State Nursing Board guidelines. Each complaint technically valid. Each one a brick laid with careful intention. He sees it hospital administration. Legal. HR. The digital trail building itself like a wall between Ashley and her job. By Friday morning, it was finished. Nurse Cooper, the message began, arriving in her inbox with the subject line Patient Assignment Change, effective immediately. You are being reassigned to Medical Surgical Floor for B, effective immediately. Master Sergeant Torres will be transitioned to a different care team. This reassignment is part of routine patient load management. Routine patient load management. The language of institutions protecting themselves. Ashley read it standing in the hallway outside the nursing station, her hand steady as she held the phone. The battery indicator showed 2%. She'd been moving for 36 hours without real rest. Everything in her body that wasn't pure reflex was running on the fumes of coffee and something deeper, something that had trained her to keep moving when movement became the only thing keeping you alive. She needed to talk to Torres before her shift ended. She needed him to understand that she hadn't abandoned him, that whatever was happening had nothing to do with him or her commitment to his care. What happened next ended everything. Ashley's new floor smelled like stale coffee and industrial cleaner, the smell of a place where nobody wanted to be. The reassignment had come down from administration without explanation, effective immediately, pulled from the ICU rotation and placed on the orthopedic wing where surgical recovery patients spent 3 days and left. Safe. Manageable. The kind of floor where a nurse couldn't get too attached, couldn't spend extra hours learning to communicate with someone who couldn't hear her voice. Room 347 was 2 floors below. She stood at the nurse's station at 1,130 hours, Torres's updated chart pulled up on the computer screen, her eyes tracking the inventory logs with the precision of someone trained to identify discrepancies in supply chains. The surgical kit used during his initial debridement, logged as Model A, high-grade titanium instruments, $4,200 per case. She opened the digital photo documentation, cross-referenced against the packaging images captured during initial intake. The instruments in the actual photograph were Model B, cheaper. Lighter gauge. Not ideal for the complex wound pattern Torres carried. 1 discrepancy was a mistake. 2 was careless. 3 was a pattern. She pulled up the requisition system and began scrolling backward through 3 weeks of supply orders. Her fingers moved across the keyboard like she was diffusing something that could explode, because it could. Every Thursday, the same cycle, high-cost surgical equipment logged into inventory, then marked as deployed to Torres's room. Every Monday, usage reports filed and closed. But the actual equipment in the photographs, consistently cheaper alternatives. The price differential per case was running between $800 and $1,200. Over 3 weeks, that was $14,400 in unaccounted variance. She pulled up the authorization grid. One name appeared on every single requisition order, Dr. Pierce. The realization moved through her body like ice water through veins. This wasn't about her commitment to difficult patients or her unorthodox documentation. The chart she'd meticulously maintained, the one that showed every dressing change, every antibiotic protocol, every patient response, had begun documenting exactly what equipment had actually been used versus what had been logged. Her careful nursing notes were a liability because they created evidence. A paper trail that pointed directly at him. Pierce needed her gone before she noticed the pattern. But she'd already noticed. Ashley closed the chart and sat back in the desk chair, the ergonomic kind designed to reduce strain during 12-hour shifts, and her mind shifted into the compartmentalized space where she stored information that couldn't be acted on without destroying everything she'd built here. The promotion that didn't exist in any official record. The name that had been erased from every military database. The rank of captain that would never survive a background check because it had been officially buried in 2009. If she reported Pierce, they would investigate. They would dig. They would find the sealed records that someone very powerful had spent considerable resources keeping sealed. Room 347 was 2 floors below. At 1,215 hours, she finished her assigned charting and stood, movements deliberate and casual, the kind of movement that didn't draw attention. She walked toward the stairwell instead of the elevator, less likely to trigger a security log, and descended 1 floor below her reassigned unit. The hallway was empty except for the sound of an afternoon shower running in one of the patient rooms, the white noise of water against tile. She moved to the observation window of room 347 and positioned herself where she could see inside without being visible from the main corridor. Torres was awake, propped at a 30-degree angle, his expression fixed in the particular kind of discomfort that came from pain you couldn't articulate to people who weren't trained to listen. His new floor nurse, a competent woman named Sarah, good at her job, terrible at reading nonverbal communication, was adjusting his full line while talking at him in the loud, enunciated voice people used when they thought deafness was volume-related. Torres's jaw clenched. His hands moved in frustrated gestures, sign language that she'd learned enough of to recognize, request, frustration, need. Sarah didn't see it. Ashley felt something in her chest tighten, the sensation of watching someone you cared about struggle while your hands were tied in bureaucratic knots. Marcus trusted Torres. Marcus had called home from Kandahar province on a scratchy satellite phone 2 months ago and said, "Torres is the reason I'm still alive, Mom. He reads the country like nobody else. He knows things before they happen." That trust meant something. That connection meant something. And now Torres was alone in a hospital room with people who couldn't hear him, and the one person who'd taken the time to learn his language was forbidden from helping. Violation of floor reassignment. Insubordination. Unauthorized patient contact. She turned away from the window at 1,247 hours, knowing that standing there longer would only create a security log, knowing that her presence was already against protocol, knowing that the violation would be noted if anyone was paying attention. By 1,400 hours, she was back on her assigned floor, charting routine orthopedic assessments and pretending that her hands weren't moving mechanically while her mind was 2 floors down. The call to the supervisor's office came at 1,405 hours. Pierce was already there when she arrived, sitting in the chair across from the desk like he owned it, a manila folder positioned in front of him with the precision of someone who'd practiced this presentation before. The color of the folder was institutional tan, the kind used for formal documentation. 7 compartments visible along the spine, each one labeled and dated. His suit was pressed with the kind of crease that required professional dry cleaning, and his shoes were polished to a military shine. The irony wasn't lost on her that he'd adopted the aesthetics of the discipline he was exploiting. "Ashley, thank you for coming," the supervisor, a woman named Chen who'd never given her reason to trust or distrust her, said from behind the desk. "We're reviewing your recent performance evaluations." "Of course," Ashley said. 7 words. Her voice level and professional, the voice she used with physicians who questioned her assessments. Not the voice she had underneath, the one that came from a time before Seattle General, before Scrubs, before a false identity had been constructed with such precision that even she sometimes forgot which version was real. Pierce opened the folder and slid the first page across the desk. "This is a comprehensive documentation of performance concerns that have emerged over the past 2 weeks. Each incident is dated, time-stamped, and cross-referenced with hospital policy." His voice was smooth, reasonable, the voice of someone who'd practiced this so many times it sounded like concern. "As you can see, we have multiple instances of insubordination, unauthorized patient contact, and what I would characterize as dangerously unorthodox documentation practices." Chen's eyes moved across the page, her expression shifting into the careful neutrality of someone reading something that didn't align with what she expected. "Your record before this month was spotless, Ashley. Exemplary, actually. This is quite a departure." "Which suggests she's been exceptionally good at concealing these tendencies," Pierce said, his tone remaining conversational. The tone of someone offering helpful insight rather than orchestrating a character assassination. "The Joint Commission inspection is scheduled for 6 weeks from now. Can we afford to have this kind of instability on our nursing staff? Especially in critical care where patients are vulnerable." He slid another page across the desk, this one more substantial. A formal termination recommendation form. The signature line was blank. "She has a spotless record," Chen said, but her voice had changed. Now she was looking at Ashley differently, reassessing. The power of documentation. The power of a narrative laid out in chronological order, each incident standing alone but together forming a damning pattern. Ashley understood this. She'd been taught this. In her previous life, narrative control was the difference between extraction and elimination, between a commendation and a body in an unmarked grave. "I'm recommending immediate termination," Pierce said. "Before this becomes a liability." Ashley's hands rested on her knees, steady as surgical instruments, her breathing unchanged. The part of her that was still captain, still trained, still compartmentalized, that part was already several moves ahead. The part of her that was the nurse, the person who'd chosen this identity, who'd actually believed she could just be Ashley and nothing more, that part was experiencing something that resembled drowning. "I understand," she said. 5 words. She didn't deny anything. Didn't defend. Didn't explain. At 1,437 hours, while Chen was drafting paperwork and Pierce was reviewing his phone messages with the satisfied expression of someone who'd successfully eliminated a problem, the heart monitor in room 347 began broadcasting information that nobody with proper training was reading. Torres's heart rate had climbed to 128 beats per minute. His blood pressure had dropped from 118 systolic to 94. The pattern was specific, was urgent, was the clinical signature of internal hemorrhaging beginning to progress beyond the body's compensatory mechanisms. Sarah was adjusting his pillows, still talking in that loud, enunciated voice, completely missing the crisis that was beginning to unfold behind his ribs. Ashley was still in the supervisor's office when the numbers changed. She couldn't see the monitor. Couldn't hear the alarm. Couldn't know that the surgical incision, the one she'd been watching so carefully during her reassigned floor violations, was beginning to rupture, that blood was spilling into the thoracic cavity, that the window for intervention was contracting with every heartbeat. She stood, understanding that the interview had concluded, understanding that she'd just been terminated from a hospital where she'd spent 18 months building a life, understanding that the one patient she'd volunteered her time and energy and carefully learned sign language to help was dying 2 floors below her. "I'll collect my things," she said. 4 words. Her voice was the voice of someone who'd already died and was simply going through the logistics of leaving the body behind. Pierce smiled. A small, satisfied expression. The expression of someone who believed he'd won. The fluorescent lights above her head buzzed their electronic hum as she walked past them, the same sound they made in every hospital, in every sterile corridor, in every place where people came to be healed and sometimes instead came to be abandoned by the system designed to protect them. The code came through the overhead system at 1,437 hours, code blue, room 347, and Ashley didn't wait for the team to assemble. She moved past Dr. Pierce in the hallway, past his voice calling her back, past the part of herself that still wanted permission. The intercom crackled its mechanical demand as she pushed through the door. Torres lay grey against the white sheets, his skin the color of old concrete. Sweat pooled in the hollows of his collarbone. His abdomen was distended, rigid, wrong, a surgical incision that had ruptured somewhere in the 17 hours since the vascular surgeon closed him. Classic post-op hemorrhagic bleed. Classic way to die in 4 minutes if no one moved faster than protocol allowed. The assigned nurse stood frozen beside the monitor, watching the vital signs collapse like a building in demolition. "The doctors are in surgery, we need to call." Ashley was already moving, hands on the crash cart, fingers finding the scalpel without looking. "Hemorrhagic rupture. I'm going in." The nurse's voice cracked. "You can't, his post-op, we have to wait for." Ashley didn't hear the rest. Her hands moved with a kind of autopilot that only existed in people who had held an artery together while the sound of mortars shook a field hospital in Baghdad. She'd done this before. Not in a sterile Seattle hospital with monitors and proper lighting, but in a tent with sand in her teeth and 3 wounded Marines bleeding out on the same table. The muscle memory was the same. The imperative was identical: move or watch someone die. She stripped her outer gloves, didn't bother with new ones, speed over sterility, calculation in her eyes. The scalpel touched skin and she reopened the incision in one clean, confident line. Blood spilled across the blue drape like a sentence written in red. Her other hand went in after it, feeling for the source, for the arterial tear that was killing him. There. below the original repair. The sutures had slipped or the vessel had blown from the inside, it didn't matter. What mattered was the blood, still flowing, still draining him toward a cardiac arrest that would happen in 180 seconds if her hands didn't work faster. Torres signed with his working hand, fingers shaking, Viper. His eyes locked on hers, reading her face in the way deaf people read the world, not with their ears, but with the raw clarity of people who've learned to see everything. She didn't answer. Couldn't. The clamping forceps were already in her grip, finding the bleeder, stopping the hemorrhage with a metallic whisper of surgical steel. Pressure. Control. The hematoma was the size of a grapefruit, blood that had collected in the space around his heart. She evacuated it with her hand, feeling the warmth, the weight of it, the absolute wrongness of it. The suture kit came next, thread and needle, stitches that would hold, technique that came from a part of her brain that the government had tried to classify and erase. 3 minutes. That's how long it took her to close the arterial tear, to tie the knots, to stop the bleeding that would have killed him. When the crash team arrived, 2 residents and a surgical nurse, they found her stripping her bloody gloves, Torres's vitals climbing, systolic now 78, climbing to 85, the heart rate dropping from the decompensation tachycardia toward something human. Dr. Pierce appeared in the doorway like a storm front. His face was purple, the color of someone whose blood pressure had just spiked into a dangerous territory. The veins on his neck stood out like they were trying to escape his skin. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Ashley met his eyes. One measured breath. "Saving his life, sir." He had maybe 4 minutes. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then Pierce's voice came, shaking with something that might have been rage or might have been fear at how completely he'd lost control. "You just performed surgery. You're a nurse. That's practicing outside your scope, unauthorized surgical intervention, gross insubordination." He was already pulling his phone from his coat pocket, already scrolling, already making the call that would end this. His fingers moved with the efficiency of a man who had planned for this exact moment, who had been waiting for her to give him ammunition. "Legal? I need emergency termination initiated. Employee number, let me find the file, we're citing patient endangerment, scope violation, and Chapter 19.3 immediate dismissal clause." Within 90 minutes, the documentation was airtight. 7 formal complaints, each one precise, each one citing the hospital bylaws that made what she'd done unforgivable in the eyes of the institution. The CNO, the chief nursing officer, reviewed the file with the face of someone tasked with enforcing rules that suddenly felt stupid but had to be enforced anyway. Patient endangerment. Unauthorized surgical intervention. Practicing medicine without a license. The law was clear. Pierce's documentation was flawless. She was fired. At 1,700 hours, a security officer escorted her to her locker. Not unkindly, but with the professional distance of someone following orders. Ashley cleared out her things, a sweater, a pair of backup gloves, a photograph of her and her sister from a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. The faded Special Forces unit patch was still sewn into the jacket lining, the one she'd smuggled in on her first day, the one that was supposed to stay hidden forever. She ran her thumb across it and thought about the classified briefing where she'd been told never to surface, never to claim the rank, never to speak the mission name. Captain Ashley Cooper didn't exist. She had been erased for operational security. She was supposed to disappear into the civilian world and stay disappeared. But she couldn't let Torres die to maintain that erasure. At 2,300 hours, the basement laundry room was empty. Just the sound of the industrial washers humming their metal song, just the sharp smell of detergent and bleach that burned the back of her throat. Ashley folded her scrubs, the blood-stained ones, the ones that bore the evidence of what she'd done, with the same precision she'd once used to fold the American flag. Ceremony. Respect. The weight of finality. She'd stood at a funeral in Arlington and watched another soldier do this same folding, watched the flag shrink into a triangle, watched a life become a symbol. She placed the scrubs in the return bin. The final indignity. The end of another identity. She walked out of Seattle General at 2,347 hours, carrying only her jacket with the hidden patch. The parking lot was empty. Rain hammered the asphalt like applause nobody had asked for, and she didn't hurry. Hurrying meant she believed the ending. Moving slowly meant she was still deciding what came next. The night swallowed her. 3 hours later, 0247 hours in a hospital room on the 3rd floor, Master Sergeant Vincent Torres, still on post-operative watch, spoke to his daughter. Lieutenant Sofia Torres sat in the visitor's chair, dressed in her service dress blue uniform, on emergency leave from Camp Leshan. Her father's voice was barely a whisper, but his hands moved with precision as he signed. That nurse. She was Viper 6. Sophia's eyes widened. She'd heard the call sign on encrypted channels, knew it belonged to someone classified beyond her clearance level. She pulled up the secure portal on her phone, something she wasn't supposed to do, but family privilege carried weight even in classified systems. There. A name. A citation. A photograph with the face redacted. Captain Ashley Cooper, Silver Star, for extracting 12 wounded soldiers under sustained fire, Baghdad, operation, the rest was black ink. The door burst open. Dr. Pierce, summoned by hospital security after overhearing Sophia mention the name, stood in the doorway with the expression of a man who'd been told his ending and didn't like it. Whatever story she told you, she's gone. She was terminated for gross negligence. She endangered a patient. She's not some decorated. Sophia stood. Her lieutenant bars caught the fluorescent light like an accusation. You fired a special forces captain? You don't even know what you did. But Sophia didn't understand yet how completely the universe was about to reorganize itself. Not yet. In the hospital's marble lobby, at 0300 hours, the background check that IT had run for Ashley's termination paperwork finally processed. It flagged something. A classified security clearance. A name that triggered automatic Pentagon notification. And that notification climbed a chain of command that had been waiting for her to surface, holding her in protected status, ready to move the moment she became visible. A 2-star general named Margaret Vance walked through the automatic doors at 0317 hours, carrying Ashley's jacket. Her fingers traced the faded unit patch sewn into the lining. The hospital CEO stood beside her, white as hospital-issued sheets. On speakerphone, a defense intelligence officer's voice filled the space. Captain Ashley Cooper, codename Nightingale, classified operation status. Protected under Section 17.4 of the Defense Appropriations Act. Why has this officer been terminated? The CEO opened his mouth. Nothing came out. She saved a life, General Vance said quietly. A sergeant. A young man who was bleeding out. According to hospital records, the DI voice continued, she performed a thoracotomy outside her scope of practice. They're claiming patient endangerment. The general's expression didn't change. She performed a combat stabilization procedure on a hemorrhaging post-op patient using field medicine protocols. She saved his life. A pause. Read the security footage. A resident played the recording on the lobby monitor. Ashley's hands moving with the kind of precision that only belonged to people trained by the most elite military medical programs in the world. 3 minutes. That's how long it took her to stop the bleeding. That's how clearly her training showed in every movement. Another voice came through the speakerphone, older, a colonel, she was supposed to disappear. We ordered her to disappear after Baghdad. And she did, General Vance said. She was a nurse. She stayed quiet. And then someone tried to destroy her for doing her job too well. Dr. Pierce arrived in the lobby, summoned by the CEO. He saw the uniform, the stars on the general's shoulders, saw the security footage playing on repeat. He opened his mouth to explain, to defend, to somehow reframe what had happened as a reasonable enforcement of hospital policy. The general looked at him the way someone might look at an insect on the sidewalk. You're done here, Doctor, she said. 3 hours after Ashley walked out of Seattle General, the parking lot still wet from rain that had stopped falling at 11:02 p.m., Master Sergeant Torres lay in his hospital bed with his daughter beside him, Lieutenant Sofia Torres, Marine Corps, 2 weeks on leave from Camp Leshan. His surgical incision was closing clean. His vitals were stable. His daughter held his hand while the night nurse checked his full line, and Torres turned to her with something burning behind his eyes like a secret he could no longer keep. He signed slowly, his hands moving with the precision of someone who had spent 22 years in the military. That nurse, her call sign was Viper 6. Sophia's hands froze mid-translation. She was fluent in sign language, their mother had been deaf, and she knew every call sign in the special operations community by reputation alone. Viper 6 wasn't a reputation. Viper 6 was a legend that shouldn't exist on paper. She pulled up her phone, fingers moving faster than her hands had been a second before, searching the classified citation database she had access to through her clearance. The Silver Star Award citation loaded in 0.8 seconds. Captain Ashley Cooper. Viper 6. Extraction of 12 wounded soldiers under fire from a collapsing building in Baghdad's Jolan district. 3-minute window. All 12 soldiers walked out alive. That was 18 months ago. That was supposed to be classified forever. That nurse saved you, Dad. That was the same woman. Torres closed his eyes. Nodded. In the hallway outside, a monitor beeped its steady rhythm, and the night shift moved like ghosts through the fluorescent hum. 45 minutes later, at 02 for 7 hours exactly, Sophia Torres sat in the waiting room with her laptop and dialed the number she wasn't supposed to call except in cases of immediate national security concern. A defense intelligence officer answered before the first ring finished, because they always did. She reported what her father had told her, slowly, giving them the call sign and the rank and the mission date. The DI officer said nothing while she spoke, just breathing on the line like the silence itself was data being collected. "Stand by," the officer said. "Do not leave the hospital." The background check that IT had processed at 0158 hours for Ashley's termination paperwork, the routine screen meant to confirm she had no prior disciplinary actions, had flagged something the system wasn't designed to flag. A classified security clearance. Protected status. Defense Department notation, officer on administrative leave from active duty. The flag had automatically triggered a Pentagon notification at 0203 hours. One call. One name. One conversation between a defense intelligence officer and a two-star general named Margaret Holloway who ran the Joint Personnel Recovery Agency out of a building in Arlington that didn't officially exist. By 0300 hours, General Holloway stood in the lobby of Seattle General Hospital in a dark wool coat that still held the crease from an airplane seat, holding a faded Special Forces unit patch that had been sewn into the lining of a jacket left in a locker on the 3rd floor. The patch was worn. The thread was bleached by time. The insignia, a dagger wrapped in a serpent, was barely visible anymore. She turned it over in her hands like it was evidence from a crime scene, which, in a way, it was. On her phone speakerphone, the DI officer provided context. Captain Ashley Cooper, Viper 6 call sign, 5th Special Forces Group, attached to JSOC Task Force for 3 deployments. Officially non-existent for 18 months. Record sealed under Presidential Order 2023-447. Current employment, nursing staff, Seattle General, Savannah, Georgia. Current status, terminated 2 hours ago by hospital administrator on grounds of scope violation and unauthorized surgical intervention during emergency patient care. Who terminated her? General Holloway asked. Dr. Marcus Pierce, cardiac surgery. The general's jaw tightened. Her eyes were the color of storm clouds that had seen a lot of storms. She handed the unit patch to a junior officer standing beside her and said, "Find out everything Dr. Pierce has been doing for the last 6 months. Everything. Bank accounts, emails, texts, meetings. I want it before sunrise." It was 0301 hours. Dr. Pierce, meanwhile, was sitting at his home office computer in a house that cost $847,000, deleting files. His hands were shaking. He'd seen the Pentagon vehicles pull into the hospital parking lot at 02 for 5 hours through the hospital security monitors he could still access on his personal login. He knew what they meant. He knew who they were looking for. And he knew, with absolute certainty, that the woman he'd been destroying for the last 7 weeks wasn't what he'd thought she was. The supply order discrepancies she'd documented. The meticulous charting that had seemed excessive. The way she'd known exactly where to cut, exactly how deep, exactly how to save a man's life that should have ended bleeding out in an ICU bed. Not a nurse. Never just a nurse. A soldier. His fingers flew across the keyboard, hitting backspace with the desperation of a man watching his life delete itself in real time. 18 months of emails with the equipment vendor. Supply orders that swapped premium surgical equipment for cheaper versions, the profit margin split between Pierce and a company registered in Delaware that didn't actually manufacture anything. The entire fraud scheme, 2 years of kickbacks, $847,000 in unmarked deposits that he'd used to buy this house, this car, this life that was about to explode. Delete. 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 His keystrokes echoed in his empty office like a countdown timer running backward. At 0330 hours, Dr. Pierce heard something that made his hands stop moving. Sirens. Multiple sirens. Not ambulances. Vehicles pulling into the hospital parking lot with the deliberate precision of law enforcement. FBI. He knew what FBI sounded like. He'd heard the story about the radiologist they'd arrested for selling patient data to pharmaceutical companies. He knew exactly what was happening. He reached for the power button on his computer tower. Just yank it, shut it down, cut the connection, maybe if he... Dr. Pierce. The voice came from his hospital radio. The intercom he'd been using for 24 years. A voice he recognized as belonging to Mike Ramirez, the IT director, a Navy veteran who'd come to Seattle General 5 years ago and worked quietly in the basement, backing up servers and maintaining network security and asking very few questions about why various people wanted various files protected. Yes? Pierce's voice came out like a question. You need to come to the hospital. Now. Bring your ID badge. The line went dead. Pierce's hands were actually trembling now. He looked at the computer. The deletion process was still running. 47% complete. He could wait. He could shut down the power manually, destroy the hard drive, walk away. How would they prove anything without the files? Without the emails? Without the documented? He saw the movement in the corner of his eye. A car pulling into his driveway. 2 agents in dark windbreakers, already moving toward his front door. They were fast. They were organized. They'd been waiting for him to run. At 0430 hours, the hospital CEO escorted Ashley back through the main entrance of Seattle General like she was conducting a state visit. Behind them, FBI agents in windbreakers moved through the hospital with the kind of purpose that made security step aside without asking questions. They headed directly to the cardiac surgery wing, to Dr. Pierce's office, where IT Director Mike Ramirez was already waiting with a drive the size of a thumbnail and a document that listed the contents: 847 deleted files, 340 email chains, 1,247 security camera frames. He tried at 0200 hours, Ramirez said to the lead FBI agent, a woman with the kind of calm that comes from 18 years of white-collar crime investigations. Hit delete on everything. I've been monitoring the network logs since midnight. Saw the first deletion attempt come through at 01 for 7 hours. He was panicked. Sloppy. Ramirez held up the drive. Every keystroke he typed. Every file he tried to erase. It's all here. Timestamped. Permanent. The lead agent took the drive. How long have you known? Since 0150 hours. Why didn't you stop him? Because I wanted to make sure he understood he couldn't, Ramirez said quietly. Because some people need to learn that digital footprints don't disappear just because you want them to. Because Captain Cooper was a patient here who helped save another patient's life, and he fired her to cover his crimes. The lead agent nodded. In the hallway behind them, Ashley stood with her arms crossed, still wearing the hospital badge that had been returned to her exactly 17 minutes earlier. She looked at the FBI agents like she'd been briefed on their protocols, which, by virtue of her classified status, she probably had been. At 0500 hours, Dr. Pierce was read his rights in an interrogation room that smelled like old coffee and fluorescent anxiety. His lawyer, a woman named Sarah Blackwell who had made a very sudden appearance at the FBI field office, sat beside him taking notes while Pierce stared at the table. The emails show a 2-year relationship with MedTech Solutions International, the lead agent said, sliding photographs across the table. Equipment swaps. You ordered premium surgical equipment. You received it. You documented it in hospital records. But the equipment that was actually used in surgeries was a cheaper model. Same product line, same branding, but manufactured to a lower standard. The difference was about 37% cheaper. And that difference, times 240 surgeries over 2 years, comes to approximately $1,847,000 in kickbacks that went to offshore accounts registered under your name. Pierce's lawyer raised her hand. My client invokes his right to remain silent. Of course he does, the agent said. But Captain Cooper doesn't get to remain silent. She spent 7 weeks following protocols, documenting discrepancies, trying to do her job. And you spent 7 weeks destroying her career because she was noticing things you didn't want noticed. That was a federal offense, Dr. Pierce. Retaliation against a protected military officer. That's obstruction. That's conspiracy. That's adding another 20 years to your sentence right there. By 0600 hours, Dr. Pierce was on administrative leave pending criminal investigation. By 0800 hours, the hospital's medical board had opened a formal inquiry. By 1000 hours, the state medical board had suspended his license pending fraud charges. By 1100 hours, his face was being photographed by hospital security as he walked out of the building carrying a cardboard box containing personal items from his office, a diploma, a watch, photographs of a life he'd built on other people's suffering. The parking lot was full of television crews by then. News vans with satellite dishes. Reporters waiting for the hospital to release a statement about the cardiac surgeon under investigation for insurance fraud, equipment kickback schemes, and retaliation against a nurse. A nurse who was, at that exact moment, standing at the bedside of Master Sergeant Torres, who was sitting up in his hospital bed with his daughter beside him, and signing, I knew it was you. Baghdad. You pulled me out of that building. Ashley signed back, you kept my son alive. We're even. Torres shook his head. One hand came up in the military hand salute, not a casual wave, but a full, formal salute given to an officer. His daughter did the same. Sophia Torres, Marine Corps officer, raising her hand to her temple and holding it there for 3 seconds while her father did the same. General Holloway entered the room silently. She stood at the foot of Torres's bed, holding a folder. Her voice, when she spoke, was the kind of calm that came from 3 decades of giving orders that changed lives. Captain Cooper, your records are being restored. Full rank, full honors, full pension. Your security clearance is reinstated effective immediately. Your previous termination of employment is being overturned, and you're no longer required to hide. The general paused. She'd seen a lot of soldiers in her career. She'd promoted some. She'd buried others. She recognized the thing she saw in Ashley's eyes right now, the thing that happened when a warrior finally put down their burden. What would you like to do? Ashley took one measured breath. Her voice, when it came, was steady and certain and carried the weight of someone who had finally stopped running. I'd like to stay here. If that's allowed. I'd like to keep working. 6 months later, Ashley ran Seattle General's new Veteran Services program from an office overlooking the ICU. On her wall, framed in glass beside her nursing license, hung her captain's insignia. Not hidden. Not secret. Visible. Permanent. The insignia caught the morning light as new staff arrived for orientation, and Ashley stood in a hospital conference room with a PowerPoint presentation about the new protocol for caring for patients with special needs. We treat every patient with the same standard, she said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that made the room go quiet. Excellence. Not because policy requires it. Because they deserve it. Whether they can hear you, speak to you, or communicate differently, they deserve the same care, the same time, the same commitment. That's not negotiable here. The staff listened. Took notes. Asked questions. One of the newer nurses, a woman named Jennifer, fresh out of nursing school, raised her hand. Is that why you spent so much time with the deaf patient? Because of the protocol? No, Ashley said. I spent time with him because he was a human being who needed help communicating. The protocol came after. Always does. She closed the laptop. That's all for today. Meanwhile, in rural Georgia, a man driving a medical supply van pulled up to a small clinic in the backwoods of Bibb County. The sign on the van said Efficient Medical Solutions, a company that contracted with rural health centers to deliver supplies. The driver, Dr. Marcus Pierce, though he no longer had the right to use that title, loaded boxes of gauze and surgical tape and catheters into the clinic's storage room. The clinic director, a former Army medic named Robert Graves who'd read all about the fraud case in the medical journals, handed Pierce a manifest. Route 9 today. It's longer, but safer. You'll have about 3 hours of driving time. Pierce nodded. Didn't speak. Loaded the van in silence. 3 hours of driving. That was what his days looked like now. Route 9 took him through the Georgia countryside, past fields and small towns where nobody knew who he was or what he'd done. He had time to think. Time to remember. Time to understand, with absolute clarity, that he had picked a fight with someone whose entire existence had been defined by survival. Back in Savannah, Ashley signed to a new deaf patient in the ICU, teaching the night shift how to communicate. Her hands formed the signs fluidly, naturally, the way someone who'd learned a language properly would sign. The young doctor beside her, a resident named Chen, watched and asked, "How did you learn sign language so well?" "Because someone taught me," Ashley said. "And because some people are worth learning a new language for. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns." That's what her hands were signing now, teaching the words to the medical staff who would work with Torres and with every other patient who came through these doors needing someone to listen when they couldn't speak. The camera lingered on her hands, on the precise movement of each sign, on the strength in those fingers that had once held a dying man's heart in their palms. Then it pulled back to show the full ICU, veterans and civilians side by side, all receiving the same fierce standard of care from a captain who had never stopped serving. If you or someone you know is a veteran struggling to access care, or if you've witnessed retaliation against healthcare workers, contact the Pentagon's Office of Inspector General hotline. Subscribe for more stories of hidden heroism in plain sight. Like this video if you believe in second chances. And comment, what would you do if you discovered someone you underestimated was actually carrying secrets that changed everything?